Hi folks, welcome. Mr. Deep here. Today this video is about how to escape the Matrix, which is kind of a follow-up to my video, What is the Matrix? And in that video I talk about the Matrix being a control system that is not just three-dimensional but operates from other dimensions. For myself personally, I've always been a bit of a truth seeker. I was a born-again Christian for 6 years. And I also did psychotherapy, which was very helpful for me. I overcame, I guess, childhood trauma and rebalanced my emotional center. And I guess you could say I had a kind of honeymoon after that in that things were going well. But at some point, the honeymoon ended. And it was a dilemma because I thought, is it an emotional issue? Is it a mental issue? But I began to realize that it was a spiritual crisis or a spiritual dilemma. And I remember reading The Active Side of Infinity by Carlos Castaneda, and in that book Don Juan talks about the flyers, and to sum it up, essentially we are being undermined by hidden forces or spiritual parasites, and that there was a otherness, that these parasites install a kind of program over the mind. And I think what was interesting was this idea that our weaknesses are not just our own, that there are forces or entities that essentially inject thought and amplify our own emotions. So there's an otherness to this kind of spiritual battle. In my previous years within Christianity, I had a belief about the devil, but what was occurring as I began to sort of, I guess you could say, wake up, is to have a very direct experience of this negative force. And it was much more real, much more revealing than my previous belief-based devil concept. And one thing I've come to realize about this devil character is its ability to deceive. And one of the main ways is to give the average person only part of his identity, enough of his identity in order to deceive you. And the thing is, it's a relationship, because that deception is only possible by your own lack of inner development and your own ignorance, your own lower level of consciousness. So essentially, that deception is not possible when you actually wake up. The other consideration too is that if we were to eliminate this devil character, the whole waking up process and the forces that keep us asleep could very much be called cosmic principles and be regarded as spiritual science. So if the devil character is a bit hokey pokey for you, you could say that there are very much spiritual principles at work within the system, this 3D, this matrix system, that are cosmic principles that one could personify as the devil. So the first step to escaping the matrix is to realize and sense that we're actually in a matrix in the first place. And as I've kind of referenced, to escape, one must know and overcome these forces within a man that keeps them locked into this matrix system. Now, in some esoteric circles, this awakening is called initiation, and which is essentially overcoming the matrix world and becoming free from its law. Now, Moraviev talks about the general law, which is basically the laws of this matrix system. And he says the executioner, the enforcer of these laws is the devil. But again, you can look at this as cosmic principles, cosmic laws that operate this particular system, keeping a man asleep. And one thing I will say as a former Christian, there's this common belief that because Jesus has overcome this world, this matrix system, by default and by belief, we also overcome. And I would have to say I disagree with this. I think that salvation needs to be worked out for oneself, and it's a tremendously challenging task to achieve. I would further say that if the churches understood the true cost of awakening, that a lot of the churches would in fact be empty. Essentially, the matrix is somewhat of a test, and only a true warrior escapes it. And what I want to say too, to kind of contrast between this belief in Jesus overcoming, is that when you truly awaken, you awaken the divine DNA inside, which could be called cosmic consciousness. One could even say it's similar to Christ consciousness. So it's not so much you purely doing it on your own efforts, but when you truly make those efforts within yourself, the divine awakening meets those efforts in order to help you. But it is a salvation that is based on effort, not simply by belief. And I would say that belief is very dangerous because it makes you susceptible to all kinds of illusions and deceptions. So now I want to talk a little bit about the process, and part of the process is a purified emotional center. Many people these days are carrying trauma from childhood, and what happens with that sort of emotional imbalance is we tend to have a cover over it, and that cover is a general dishonesty within ourselves. I'm aware of the ideas of Christian honesty, but this honesty is of a much deeper nature. One has to know themselves on a much deeper level in order to open up those doors of honesty, so to speak. And that brings us to, I guess, the principle that Jung talks about, which is making the unconscious conscious, and basically bringing to light the shadows. And these shadows are not found on the tip iceberg conscious superficial world of man. They are found much deeper. It's about knowing what one doesn't know about oneself. And I would add further that this realm is not just shadows, but it may be a realm in which these feeders, these spiritual parasites, in fact, live, feed, and exist. So making the unconscious conscious also flushes out those feeders of our lower vibrational energies. Another aspect is responding to divine shocks. Now, Moraviev talks about these B-influences, and you could call them wake-up calls, and generally people don't like the wake-up call because it threatens what he calls the A-influence, or the man of the world influenced by the things of the world. And in my other videos, I also mention importantly what I call the D-influence, and it's a trickster or an imposter influence. In other words, it will, on the one hand, it will be the influence that will make your world collapse. Then that influence will shapeshift into a savior in order to then trap you into what seems like a divine influence, but is in fact a trickster influence. What I would say, though, is that the B influence, a true divine influence that's responded to, which generally connects with some kind of crisis or collapse within the A influence world, when it's responded to and understood, one senses the love in this particular influence, and one, in the process of awakening, will move more and more towards this influence. And this, in turn, will increase what I call divine synchronicity. Essentially, you have, most people have a very weak magnetic center, but as you open up to this divine influence, the magnetic center gets stronger, and it essentially turns so that you align, and your coincidences, your energy, and your intent move to more and more towards this special kind of divine influence. And this influence, the connection is from, you could say, the divine seed within, or the divine DNA, but it connects you to the divine that sits outside of the matrix systems. And I even go as far as to say that it's almost like an unknown God, because generally the systems of spiritual and religious systems that are put before us are generally always a mix of anti-divine and divine principles. So as the seed genuinely awakens, it connects to a divine principle or creator, you could say, that sits outside of the system, because there's no proper fit within the systems that are presented to you in this matrix world. Moraviev also mentions, as this process is taking place, you start to access what he calls C influence. And C influence is essentially people of C influence. In other words, those that are further along the path. And I would say further that those influences may not be meeting in the flesh. It could be by way of that synchronicity where you are thinking, feeling, or need help in this particular awakening path, and then the book arrives or the video arrives in a timely manner, and that book is offering an influence or information that is just a couple of steps ahead of yourself. The goal of all of this is to actually be reborn, but not in a belief sense, but in a direct, real sense. And it's referred to in esoteric circles as an initiation. And it's what I regard as the narrow road. And the narrow road is a true, genuine escape from the matrix system. It's like the lotus flower that emerges beyond the water. In another video, I talk about 3 types of rebirth. I talk about the belief-based Christian rebirth. I talk about the Luciferian rebirth, which is very intense and elaborate, but essentially falls under one Luciferian expression or God or another. What I'm talking about is a 3rd rebirth, which activates the divine. It connects you to the divine that sits beyond this matrix, but somehow we have planted within us a very special code that connects us to the creator outside the matrix. I was reading a book called The Holotropic Mind, and it was very interesting how people regressed into the whole birth experience. And we talk about birth and we take the process for granted, but I think we forget how incredibly intense, terrifying, and painful the experience is for both the mother and the child. And I think this is important to consider because the birth of the Christian world, the birth that I had, compared to the birth, which was way more traumatic, of truly awakening, is just another world. So I want us to really contemplate what true birth is, what a true rebirth is. So as confronting as the inner matrix is, and as daunting as it can seem, the matrix follows very specific laws. And part of that law is, I guess, an agreement or a connection. And what I mean by that is that the matrix can only work and interact and trap you through your own weak blind spots. And it's therefore your responsibility to remove the places within inside of you that plug you into this control system. And it's also worth considering that this system feeds on lower vibrational energy. And that can take the form of all of the negatives, the hate, the anger, etc., etc. And one thing will happen is as you start to penetrate or break from the matrix, the challenges will become more refined. And that is essentially because as you remove the plugs or the footholds, then you tap deeper into those more subtle connections you have to the matrix, which, to be quite honest, can be quite terrifying, but still need to be overcome. But as this is all taking place, the divine is also helping you in these steps. One book that was particularly helpful for me was The Hidden Forces of Life by Sri Aurobindo. And he says essentially, putting in my words, that a true path will always involve attack from hostile forces. But essentially what all of this leads to, if the work is done correctly, it leads to a point which I call the threshold, in which the gate is open. In other words, it's almost like the system and the master of the system turns around and opens the gate. He has to give you up. He can no longer claim sovereignty over your being, and you therefore fall under a new jurisdiction. But this jurisdiction is not belief-based. It is based on tremendous work. It is based on the divine helping you, but there is a night and day that is not belief-based in overcoming the world. You actually have become a warrior in which you yourself has overcome the matrix, the world, with the help of the divine. And so your role now is to try to help be a man or woman of influence and help other people cross over to actually escape the matrix. And I always mention this is important. Many people are realizing a control system, then the next step is this matrix system. But very few people are really liberating from the inner matrix. And this is what's important. And furthermore, what I would say is that this may seem strange, but when it comes down to it, the most dangerous thing a human being can do is to escape the inner matrix. As much as all of these other control systems and mechanisms seem like a threat to the controllers, the biggest and scariest thing a man can do is to awaken from the matrix genuinely within. So there's some ideas on how to escape the matrix, and I hope it helps some of my viewers. Thanks for your attention.